I'm Professor Stephen Coleman, and I've spent many years researching and writing about political communication. I'm interested in how politicians speak to us, how we speak to them, and what we think of each other. In this podcast series, we'll explore how politicians use language to influence us. We'll look at the tricks and techniques they use, and we'll chat to some of the world's best-known scholars. In this episode, we explore the elusive concept of vocal tone, how people express themselves rather than simply focusing upon what they say. And we'll be joined by Roderick Hart from the University of Texas in Austin, who's the author of the brilliant book, Trump and Us, What He Says and Why People Listen.
His backbenchers say it's embarrassing, your words. Is everything okay, Prime Minister?
Prime Minister!
Well, Mr. Speaker, I tell you what's not working. It's that line of attack.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
And I want you all to know that we are fighting the fake news. It's fake, phony, fake.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.
It's not just what politicians say, it's the way that they say it. I mean, it's not just what politicians say, it's the way that they say it. I mean, it's not just what politicians say, it's the way that they say it. That's right, I'm talking about tone, the way in which content is given meaning by the shape of the sounds that produce it. We've all come across the toneless politician.
There are a million good reasons why you should support the national government. They are to be found in the homes where, owing to the trade revival, 1 million breadwinners are now drawing a regular wage instead of searching for work.
And then there's the tonally extravagant political orator.
I hope the main message that will go out from this conference to our movement up and down the country: don't be afraid. Don't let this great labour movement of ours be afraid. We've lived through this argument and we still survive, and we will come out a stronger Labour government, I believe, at the end. Don't be afraid. And I say to our country, our great country, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of those who tell us that we cannot run our affairs, that we have not got the ingenuity to mobilize our resources and overcome our economic problems. Of course we have. We can do that and save the freedom of our country at the same time.
And, well, if you can bear it, there's the totally, tonally incontinent.
I have been a Republican in times good, and I have been a Republican in times bad. Albert Einstein issued one of my most favorite quotes in the history of the spoken word, and it is as follows: in the middle of opportunity, in the middle of difficulty lies opportunity. I'm going to repeat that so I have clarity tonight. In the middle of difficulty lies opportunity. This is the opportunity we've been waiting for. The Stark County Treasurer's Office is a mess. If nominated tonight, I promise each and every person in this room I will hit the ground running, come out swinging, and end up winning. We're tired of business as usual.
Political speech can be like a lulling nursery rhyme, a discordant piece of experimental opera, or a drone flying overhead, again and again and again. My purpose today is to explore political tone. And if the content's not to your liking, well, just turn down the sound and listen to the ups and downs and occasional dud notes that pass for my voice. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis.
I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, A state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Imagine that you're listening to a toneless robot delivering Martin Luther King's great "I Had a Dream" speech. What are we left with without the tone of the voice? A semantically assembled message, each word and phrase as significant or insignificant as the other. If we are intellectually inclined to sympathise with the message, we will doubtlessly find reasons to do so within the words. But what will we miss? The sense of a feeling, breathing, intention-laden speaker. The sound of a sonorous voice, its volume, its pitch and its rhythm geared to shaping effects and effects. The oral image of the messenger as constituting as much, if not more, than the message. Words and phrases are designed to connect, but tone is the connector. According to neuroscientists, we hear its resonance before we comprehend its cognitive worth. Charlie Chaplin understood this when in his film The Great Dictator he captured the essence of Adolf Hitler's vile oratory without using a word of the madman's own speech.
Hey, der Straff mit Hültensekt, der Wiener Schnitzel mit der Lagerwerden und das Saukraut. Hey, der Filuten sagt der Filleben, ein Tomenia bis ein Straff, und der Blitzen sagt der Knütz. Hey, ich bleiner Straff mit der... Balloni war ein Stritz mit seinen Eltern, sagt der Hühn, ein der Straff mit seiner Klatsch, hey, der Stratz mit Sekretenten da, mit seiner Tratsch mit Sketten, mein einer Täter, wieder straffen, die straffen, sie straffen!
And listen now as we move seamlessly between Chaplin and Hitler in a single burst of tonal derangement.
Das alles ist heiß! Die große Zeit ist jetzt angebrochen. Deutschland ist nun erwacht.
Balloni war ein Stritz mit seinen Eltern, sagt der Hühn, ein der Straff mit seiner Klatsch, hey, der Stratz mit Sekretenten da, mit seiner Tratsch mit Sketten, mein einer Täter, wieder straffen.
Und er kann nicht und immer wieder muss der Leute auf Berg gerichtet werden. Es muss weitergekämpft werden, es geht nicht. Ihr dürft nicht handeln, ihr müsst gehorchen, ihr müsst euch fügen, ihr müsst euch diesem unerhörten Zwang beugen.
Through tone, politicians not only create a connection, but determine the quality of that connection. It is a way of effectively telling listeners how they want to be received. Let's consider a couple of examples. Here's a politician effectively saying to his listeners, listen to me, I know what I'm talking about.
This morning we published new data giving the first concrete evidence of how much vaccines reduce transmission within households. We've seen already that a vaccine reduces your chances of catching COVID by around 2/3. This new data looked at people who tested positive after having received 1 dose of the vaccine and found that they were up to 50% less likely to pass on the disease to someone else in their household.
That's what we might call the expert tone. There's this fact and then this fact and then of course there's this other incontrovertible fact. The tone is one of certainty and it's designed to suggest that dissent would be an unwise move. A steady, measured pace, strong, confident consonants, sentences that never end with a hint of a question mark. Political tone can be utilised to command confidence. Of course, that was Matt Hancock speaking. So the expert tone can be read in many ways. In this next clip, The politician's tonality is conversational and familiar. Listen to me, he says, because my voice is yours. You're actually listening to yourself speaking.
Every time the radical left Democrats do this and the Marxists, communists, fascists indict me, I consider it a great badge of honor because I'm being indicted for you. I am being indicted for you. I don't like that deal so much, by the way. I don't like that deal, but that's okay. No, I'm being indicted for you. I'm being indicted.
Here's the voice of the speaker as taxi driver who's grabbed your full attention on a very long journey, spilling out everything like a friend who arrives late at night with a half-drunk bottle of vodka to tell you that you're the only person that really understands them. The tone here is, you're with me or against me. And if you're with me, our voices will eventually merge into one blur of solipsistic conceit. So, can tone be learned? Well, clearly at one level, it is learned by all of us. As children, we not only are socialised to learn the semantic and syntactical elements of language, but also how to communicate appropriately in different contexts. Sociolinguists call this the pragmatics of language. At a very early age, children learn how to convey emotions through speech, how to recognise and adapt to different cultural situations, how to know when it's time to speak and time to stop, how to communicate beyond speech using facial expressions, gestures, volume, pitch and pace. And we don't only learn how to produce these effects ourselves, but to recognise when others are pulling them off or failing to do so. It's quite remarkable just how much we learn without ever realising we've learned it. It's an example of what we call practical consciousness, knowledge about the world that we know without necessarily knowing how we know it. That's how we relate to tone most of the time. Is there a case for believing that politicians are particularly good at finding the right tone? Might that be their secret skill? Well, in a few cases, politicians certainly do display impressive forms of tonal virtuosity and connection.
I'm the son of a black man from Kenya and a white woman from Kansas. I was raised with the help of a white grandfather who survived the Depression to serve in Patton's Army during World War II, and a white grandmother who worked on a bomber assembly line at Fort Leavenworth while he was overseas. I've gone to some of the best schools in America, and I've lived in one of the world's poorest nations. I am married to a black American who carries within her the blood of slaves and slave owners, an inheritance we pass on to our two precious daughters. I have brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, uncles, and cousins of every race and every hue scattered across 3 continents, and for as long as I live, I will never forget that in no other country on earth is my story even possible.
That was Barack Obama inviting us to understand who he is and where he's coming from. But other political speakers, some of whom possess reputations as great orators, strike me as having all the tonal charm of a washing machine at the height of its cycle.
I'm very grateful to the management of this cinema for giving me this opportunity of wishing you a happy new year. In southwest Wolverhampton, I have over 50,000 constituents. So although I'm out and about here almost every week throughout the year, there must be many thousands of you whom I never have the chance to come in contact with. So I want to wish you all the best of good fortune in 1954.
That was Enoch Powell, not quite striking the tone of Demosthenes. Are politicians masters and mistresses of tone then? Well, some are, and a lot aren't. But the interesting thing is that most think they are, and that's because, unlike almost any other job in the world, they only get hired by talking their way into the job. Politicians, at least in democracies, are professionally dependent upon other people liking the tone of their voice. And to become liked, they don't only simply adopt any old tone, they choose the tone that they think will be most engaging to the people they want to appeal to. The tone in which they address you tells you something about who they think you are. I adopt an authoritative tone because I believe that you're susceptible to my authority. I adopt a conversational tone because I believe you might be prepared to accept me as an equal or even a friend. I adopt a patronising tone if I think you can only comprehend messages that are spoken in capital letters. Tone is a communicative choice, and the choices that politicians make tell us who they think we are and how they want us to think of them. There are many specific political tones that we could explore, but I want to spend a few moments on just one of them, the authentic tone. This is a tone of voice that tries rather hard to say to us, this is me speaking, the same me as you'd find when I'm chatting with my friends in the bar or taking a holiday or gossiping in a parliamentary committee room. I'm a consistent sort of person. What you see is what you get. I don't perform for the microphone. I'm simply incapable of not being myself, my very authentic self. Authenticity, one of the most valuable political commodities to possess these days. To some extent, this desire for authentic politicians is a consequence of people knowing too much about the people who claim to represent them. In the past, political leaders could hide away, popping out at election time wearing their Sunday best and chucking out a few well-rehearsed lines about loving their constituents. But in our current hyper-mediated society in which cameras and microphones are everywhere, often the ones on your own iPhones, politicians have few places to hide. They're permanently on show, and they're permanently under pressure to sound like an ordinary person. The American ethnomethodologist Harvey Sachs referred to this as doing being ordinary. It's a performative accomplishment. I'm one of the guys. Politicians tell us stories about how what happened to you happened to them, how they get excited about the same things as you get excited about, and how the sound of their voices is not unlike the sound of yours. They're just one of us.
I wanted to use some of my time in Parliament to get people to think that politicians were people like them, real humans with real lives who feel stuff. So I ignored all the advice to keep my personal life out of the picture. I talked about my kids, my husband, my dad, my late mum, my mates. I gave my actual opinion in answer to the questions rather than towing the party line. I answered honestly.
I'm really delighted to have Roderick Hart with me today. He's one of the greatest scholars of rhetoric, and from his book on the sound of leadership through to his more recent collaborative work on political tone, he has helped to steer many of us along the understanding of what we're hearing when we listen to politicians. If I may, I'd like to ask you as a first question, Rod, you've identified a number of different types of political tonalities. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about them and what significance you attach to them.
Well, thank you, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be with you. That's a big question, covers a lot of territory. I think maybe the thing that got me intrigued by this whole area of study way back when I was young and a student was the curious combination of what I call the pragmatic and the transcendent. Politics is about very practical things: what kind of bridges get built, what kind of roads get paved, who gets to have help from the government for their families. And so that's the practical part of it. And then the other part is the transcendent. In some senses, politicians are always rivalrous of preachers. Both people of the cloth and politicians all talk about the values that transcend us all, that will bring us together or divide us. And so I've spent a lot of my time trying to figure out how these two very different voices come together. And I think that's what's interesting about politics, is that it has this very practical side, this very transcendent side, and people get when they get angry, they either get angry because they want unionization of workers, or they get angry because their values are somehow being snubbed by people in power. So to me, it's this dance between these two forces that make politics so interesting.
I suppose that one of the questions suggested by that is that you can't have one of these without the other. Is there anything obvious in the tone of political speech that suggests that there are ways of connecting one to the other?
Well, I think that's really the job, and that's where people, of course, fail too. I think of Winston Churchill, who had an extraordinary ability to speak in the most empowering and transcendent terms and voices, especially when the UK was fighting a war. And yet, if you read much about Churchill behind the scenes, he had his eye on the bottom line at all times. Sometimes it wasn't very pretty, the deals that he made, but of course, that's the job of politics. And yet, there are other interesting cases. There are some people, President Jimmy Carter had a real ability to speak in a transcendent voice to bring American people together. Donald Trump has no ear for the transcendent, but his emphasis on the pragmatic inspires and brings people together of a certain sort. So I think in the United States, at least, I think Barack Obama had his, and probably John Kennedy had the best way of combining those voices. And on the Republican side, I think Ronald Reagan, without question, had that ear for what is beyond us, but empowering of us. Also could talk about how we need to increase taxes or decrease taxes, and that's the game of politics, really.
It's interesting that you've given examples of people who were in power, and what comes to mind is an American politician, I think it was Mario Cuomo, who said, we politicians campaign in poetry and they govern in prose. To some extent, at least, you seem to be suggesting that there are ways in which the poetry can continue into the sphere of power.
Well, I think so. We're in that right now. We're in in the United States, but really, it's a kind of a global phenomenon of a lot of nationalist kind of rhetoric that we hadn't heard as loudly for quite some time, but it's come back. And so it's interesting how these eruptions of people calling for that transcendent voice, where a lot of countries are not, and certainly the United States is one of them, are not being very kind to migrants or immigrants. And somehow the argument is that the values of the nation are being corrupted by people coming across the border. And of course, in the United States, that's so ironic, since we're a country composed of people that weren't wanted elsewhere in the world. And so they came on our shores to create a nation. So it's fascinating that there always seems to be a need or a desire to hear those kind of preacherly intonalities that harken us back to a set of abstract values that somehow have been lost or have been misplaced. And that's syncopation of the pragmatic going up and the transcendent going down, and then having it reversed is certainly part of the warp and woof of American life. But I think it's also something that is quite, the Western democracies are all engaging in these conversations at the same time.
Now, I'd like to explore a little bit something you said before about Donald Trump having no ear whatsoever for the transcendent. And I suppose what he does have an ear for is a certain kind of opportunistic consumer market appraisal. How does that work? What is it that Trump does that seduces his audience?
It's a great question. In a recent book I wrote called Trump and Us, I argue that he really understood the language of emotions better than most. And I think that's true of a lot of hyper-partisans, activists, populists, who can somehow get people to believe that he understands your feeling states, your senses of betrayal, your senses of loss, of abnegation. At least in 2020, Trump had a wonderful ability to say, I know what you're feeling. I feel your feelings and I share them. I, the multi-billionaire, share your feelings with your blue-collar job. And that's a remarkable thing when you think about how rapacious he had been as a businessman for his entire life, cutting the budgets and cutting personnel at a whim. And yet then, and to this, we'll see a certain extent now, people still say, he feels what I feel. You know, this man whose feelings are all tied up with a dollar bill, he somehow is able to do that. And so it's not transcendent. It's not things that are above us and beyond us. But he goes inside the very gut of the American people.
That's truly fascinating. What's more pernicious in this context, Trump or his followers?
You know, a lot of people, ordinary Americans, ordinary Britons, they've been hit financially. They've had cultural changes in their lives. And I think a lot of ways those folks are feeling aggrieved in an important sense. So in a simple, you know, I guess I feel sorry for them. They're seeing, at least in the United States, they're white Americans in the rural parts of the country that have been, whose manufacturing base has been given short shrift, whose children are not moving back to the rural areas when they get out of school. One feels badly for them. Their nation is changing as the United States becomes more and more a minority, majority country. So one senses that they can look out there and say, the world doesn't look like it looked like when I was young. And I'm nostalgic, but I'm also really angry about the fact that I can't find the America in America anymore. One senses the loss that they feel that Trump is exploiting. Now, having said that, there's also a very small segment of them that are rabid nationalists and racists and all the rest. And those people are truly pernicious. But I think the majority of people who support Trump are just people who see the world passing before their eyes. And he seems to be someone who can somehow rewrite history, which of course he cannot do.
Is there such a thing as a populist political tone, do you think?
I think so. Part of it is this language of the emotions. I know what you're feeling. I particularly understand the traumas you've experienced, your family's experienced, your families back in time have experienced. And so there's always a kind of new historicism to populism of reaching back to a somehow hallowed past and trying to reconstruct it for the current times, which of course is impossible, but it feels like somehow we can rewrite history. And the populist leader is always someone who's constantly talking about the way it used to be, and how we need to retrieve those moments in history that we had, those times when you and your kind of people were in the ascendancy. So I think there is a tone, and there's an incantation. I will lead you people. I alone have the wisdom and the power, the energy, the sense of direction. Follow me as an individual, because I can fix your problems. When of course politics is always about the combination of people working together to get things done. But the populist is charismatic. The charismatic says, "Come with me. I shall lead you over the horizon."
Is there a "I feel what you feel" approach that could be taken that is not populist or Trumpian? Because on the face of it, one might think that in a democracy that is more than technocratic and bureaucratic, it would be rather nice to think that there are some kind of alignment between the people who represent and the people who are represented in terms of affective as well as cognitive understanding.
I think all politicians that are any good have got to give people a sense that they are able to hear their complaints. They are able to understand the travails of their lives. So recently, President Biden has gone to Hawaii to meet with the devastated people of Lahaina. And that's a standard thing. Whether he fully understands it, we don't know. But the leader goes to the people that have been afflicted and thereby saying, I feel your pain. And I think all good politicians do that. I think the people like Trump, who have a special ability to use that as essentially the only premise for moving forward, which essentially is, I will lead you and abandon all other people other than you, which of course is that undemocratic move that the populist makes, that it's only a certain segment of the people that are worthy of being saved and cared for.
I want to ask you as a final question, although talking to you, I think I've got about 6 hours more questions that I'd like to ask you, but I want to ask you this, and it comes from almost the final words in your wonderful book, The Sound of Leadership. And you say, only you and I as voters and hence as listeners can set the standards for public discussion, even if it means in doing so, we hear things that make us feel, dare I say it, uncomfortable. And I think, first of all, those are wonderful lines, but secondly, it makes me think that perhaps what's happened to politics is that we're in an age of kind of comfort listening, rather like the sort of lift music, elevator music you might listen to in order to take your mind off things rather than to put your mind onto things. And that when you talk about confronting what is uncomfortable, I think you say something about democracy that is quite profound, which is not that we have the right to say what we think only, but we have the duty to encounter what we have not thought or perhaps would not think. And I wonder whether you have any suggestions as to how we can move in the direction of the kind of political democracy where we can encounter the uncomfortable more easily.
That's a wonderful, thoughtful, searching question. I'm sure it's too large a question for me to answer. So another way of asking the question is, what's the role of the small d Democrat in a democracy? What obligations do we have? And I would think it's, at least in part, it's not only listening to politics for me and my kind, but for listening for what is truly something that transcends me and my kind, that I can listen for the nation. I can somehow identify with people who are unlike me, and I have the courage to herald their needs as well as my own needs and try to find some synthesis there. The best politicians, it seems to me, the great politicians like Winston Churchill, was speaking to a diverse country as all countries are, but he was able to provide, and I think that in a sense, Ronald Reagan and John Kennedy had that ability as well, as many other great politicians had, of saying, let us listen together, listening for our own needs and values, but also listening to ones that will bring together people who do not normally come together. I think that's, in a very partisan age, people tend to listen only to their side of the story. The nation's media are hard right or hard left in many countries, so we only listen to the ones that sound the way we want things to sound. And I think that's dangerous. I think it's good to listen to the way other people speak their mind, their hearts, and to try to find out what what we share in common, even though we have differences in politics. So I think there's a great obligation placed upon all of us who believe in democracy to listen to the great number of voices, including the ones we don't like. And that's on us. And I think it's also on politicians to be able to speak to those people across the great divides that currently exist.
Rod Hart, thanks enormously for your contribution. It's been a great pleasure. And my advice to people listening to this is listen to Roderick Hart's side of the story for a start, because I think that we need these reminders about what it means to be democratic. And we heard a lot of that today. So thanks very much, Rod.
You're welcome. Thank you.